There was a time in gaming where adventure games was something special, being put in an environment that was so captivating with its ambience and background that could really leave you feeling mesmerized by the beauty and the sheer thrill of exploring this unknown world. Through means of obstacles and paths and puzzles you find yourself amongst, trying to discover the way forward in your journey. ICO is a game that seems to go very unspoken amongst most AAA games, including its relative, Shadow of Colossus. But it would be hard to envision the shape of a modern AAA video games without ICO, the action-adventure game developed by Japan Studio and Team ICO, released exclusively for PlayStation 2 in September the 24th, 2001. Needless to say, ICO is one of the most important video games ever made, marking the debut of true video game director Fumito Ueda and his signature design by subtraction design philosophy. ICO has gone to inspire countless game developers since its release thanks to its beautiful blend of minimalist storytelling with perfectly tuned game design that still sends players on an unforgettable journey to this day. And of course, like many great video games, there's always a wonderful development story behind what made these games possible. But of course, if you guys are not interested in this, you can always just skip ahead to the different sections of the video. But speaking on the development itself, it's impossible to discuss what makes ICO so special without mentioning its passionate and groundbreaking director, Fumito Ueda, who would later go on to lead projects such as Shadow of the Colossus and The Last Guardian. Ueda initially started out as studying as an artist before joining the video game industry in 1995 through Warp, a development studio that led by cult game designer Kenji Eno. After struggling with his team for a year and a half, he joined Sony Computer Entertainment Japan in 1997 as of its Japan studio. After joining Sony, Ueda was inspired to make games such as featuring a young boy guiding an older woman after seeing a commercial on Japanese television of a young boy holding a woman's hand. 4 months later, he presented a conceptual trailer to Sony that he had created entirely on his own. This trailer featured a lot of the game's most crucial elements such as ICO himself, Yorda, and the castle at which the game is set. After impressing the executives at Sony, producer Kenji Kiado was also assigned to oversee the project, and of course ICO was greenlit.
やっぱ言葉が通じないっていうものを表現するためにあえて字幕は読めないようにしたってところが一番大きいですね。ただそれを何を言ってるか。
The game entered full production in October 1998. However, very quickly, the newly assembled Team ICO realized the level of visual fidelity the team had been hoping for to achieve would not be possible on PS1 hardware. Thankfully, Ueda and Kaido were able to convince Sony to allow the game to continue development on then the up-and-coming PlayStation 2. Shortly after seeing an internal presentation, and by December 1999, the team had built an entirely new graphics engine for the game based around the PS2's hardware. In fact, one of the issues that Ueda encountered shortly after this was some of the game's character designs appeared to be too realistic, with some of the game's enemies appearing too violent, which Ueda wanted to avoid. This caused Ueda to completely rethink the game's design, eventually leading him to coin the phrase "design by subtraction," in which he removed many elements of the game until it was dismantled to the bare essence of what made it special. This even included completely removing the need for a HUD or an in-game screen for where you could display your life and etc. What ICO is most fondly remembered for is this game's incredible focus and attention to detail, regarding its atmosphere with many of the game's strongest technical elements building a sense of immersion. Interiors in the castle are often spacious, and the fixed camera's focus on the center of any given room creating an oppressive and isolating atmosphere. However, during the few instances where ICO and Yorda leave the castle and explore its exterior, the game's beautiful bloom lighting and desaturated colors take center stage. The player is immediately hit with a strong reminder of how ICO was such a technical marvel 20 years ago, and how the artistry holds up today. If we forget the woeful American cover for a minute, instead, let's focus on the Japanese and European box art for the PS2 classic ICO. It is as memorable for many as the game itself, with its bold art style and rich colors. The Japanese-European art, which thankfully was also used for the recent American re-release, was directly inspired by the painting called The Nostalgia of the Infinite by Giorgio de Chirico, one of the greatest artists of the early 20th century. Dichurko, considered the founder of metaphysical art movement, was born in Greece in 1888. A surrealist in his early works, was inspired by the likes of Dali and Max Ernst, and whilst he would continue painting in the 90s, his efforts around that time of the First World War were considered his strongest, and naturally would be the inspiration behind ICO's artwork, because within the contrast of both the works you can see how much they resemble, with two small dark lonely figures dwarfed by an enormous tower. Fumito Ueda has cited his entire body of work as his big inspiration in the development of the game, alongside Eric Charlie's Another World, as the loneliness they capture so well. That feeling of being almost trapped by an overpowering building carries through into ICO and its present form from the moment you start playing until almost the very end. The level of seclusion you feel in ICO is massive, as you can quite clearly see that you're isolated, cast away from the mainland, searching your way around this big, huge, dense castle. With all this level of detail, both visually, also would add in something special with its sound design, which features very little to actual compositions, rather opting for detailed ambience that fits each scene. The game in itself is the ambience. Everything ties together really nicely, which adds to the immersion and also adds to the feeling of isolation. You can actually hear all the sounds taking place within the game, and as subtle and as simple as they are, such as the birds calling and the wind howling and the waves hitting the rocks. There's something truly magical about the experience of this game. ICO is unlike any other game with its art style. Sure, it's just like Shadow of Colossus and the likes of its other predecessors, The Last Guardian, but something really is unique about ICO that makes it stand out from the rest, and really would change the gaming industry. ICO is over 20 years old to this day, and will still massively go unnoticed to the mainstream for its underappreciated value for what it had to offer to the gaming world. Of course, this cult classic's influence on the game industry is unmistakable. Without ICO, there would be no Breath of the Wild. Without ICO, there would be no The Last of Us. Without ICO, there'd be no Bloodborne. Essentially, without ICO, gaming would be worse off. It is remarkably ironic that despite poor sales at launch, ICO has arguably had one of the most enduring impacts on the game industry in history. Yasuhide Kobayashi, who served as Sony's Japan studio vice president at the time, explained, and quote, "If the packaging was designed differently, we think it would have sold more. In fact, on the internet, many people have said that the Japanese version was better." ICO's success went on to influence so much more in the years that followed its spiritual successor, Shadow of the Colossus. It managed to get a PS3 remaster and a full PS4 remake, underlining the game's timeless beauty and brilliance. The Last Guardian continued to carry the torch in 2016. But most importantly, ICO had a profound effect on the development of From Software's Demon's Souls, which Japan studio oversaw and was also remade to its critical acclaim. Creators as director Guillermo del Toro, Halo's Josh Holmes, and Naughty Dog's Nate Wells, and Fez Fish have celebrated the 2-decade-old masterpiece for what made this game stand out that it even got noticed by such great directors. Even great director himself HIDEO KOJIMA, who would make his own adventure game that was based around similarities of ICO-style ambience, where the game is based around theme, style, aesthetic, and music. A game with artistic quality and actually a really good serving message behind a world that is solely disconnected and needs to be brought back together. And with means of travel and adventure and exploration is all the things that tie in to make a great adventure game, such as the attention to detail to your environment that you're interacting with. When I say adventure games were sorely a thing of the past, it's nice to see that they're now being reinvented, such as Death Stranding would do, which would take modern hardware and really make an adventure experience really enjoyable to play. Some may have looked at games like Death Stranding as being a walking simulator, but it was far much more than that when you look at the artistic value this has to offer. And just like that of ICO, when you look at the message behind the actual game itself, it really is an inspiring start and beginning for what really paved the way for such great adventure games. And with Death Stranding's focused on themes such as life, death, hope, and grief. And the beauty of ICO's theme is a game that transmits strong emotions about solitude, injustice, loss, death, sacrifice, overcoming your own limitations on how two helpless entities can overcome any challenge.
BT っていうのは、サムを攻撃しようとして来てるわけじゃないんですね。彼らは死んだあの世に行った人たちで、未練があってこの世にで残っているので、やっぱり人を見ると寄ってくるんですよね。
ほぼ同時に、そのボーイミーツガールってテーマにして、男の子が女の子を守りながらこうダンジョンをクリアしていくっていうビジュアルも一緒に思いついたというか発想したんですけど。
This game's beauty lies within its architecture. Everything that really fits together really nicely that would honestly open up a book of creativity. In fact, the creativity was so wide that so many different directors in different video games had to take inspiration from this title. Unlike most games, ICO's storytelling isn't necessarily done through the dialogue, it's more or less done through the environment around us. But that's the beauty of these platform adventure games, is how they can convey the world and the story that it has within to us as an audience. Such as classic titles like Mario 64 or Rayman, pretty much any kind of adventure title you could think of that gave us all an everlasting presence that still lives with us today for the wonderful amount of memories that it carries. But ICO is just totally unique. Even Uncharted 3's developer reportedly used ICO as a creative touchstone during their game's production. A game that also what you could say was massively inspired by the likes of Tomb Raider, which of course would recapture the same concepts of treasure hunting, climbing and scaling the environment as you make your way through ruins. Unlike those games, ICO would go massively unnoticed, considering that this game in itself was a big inspiration, especially for such classic title as Uncharted. Of course, Brothers A Tale of Two Sons also drew on ICO's quiet, desolate tone, to one degree or another. The most dramatic story of inspiration, however, comes from the designer Hidetaki Miyazaki. In a 2015 Guardian interview with Simon Parkin, Miyazaki described himself as an unambitious and lacking in direction. At least until he got his hands on ICO, the game awoke me to the possibilities, said Miyazaki. I wanted to make one myself. Miyazaki would of course go on to design Dark Souls, another of Japan's pivotal releases from the past decades or so. That ICO's Dark Fairy Tale has left such a mark on Miyazaki and other designers and coaxed them into making games of their own. It is a testament of the power of what Ueda and his squad of artists have created, even 20 years on. The magical power that haunts ICO's lonely castle remains undiminished. While ICO would debut on the PS2, the just released footage shows of a build development on the original PlayStation. Because yes, this game was originally meant to be for the PlayStation 1. The video is fairly close to the final game we had on PS2. We see the castle environment, waterfalls, bridges, and even the blocks that the horn boy pushes in puzzles. But there are noticeable differences such as the design of the girl who accompanies the boy for the PS1 build. The environments Ueda built still seems to hold up, with unique atmosphere, and the look of ICO instantly recognizable. The game's designer would go on to make artistically admired classics, Shadow of Colossus for the PS2 and of course The Last of the Guardian for PS4. But it's amazing to see how ICO began in its first developing stages and still looked amazingly well for its time. It's insane to look at the character models and the fluid movement that seems so ahead of its time, even back for PlayStation 1 where the controls seemed quite stiff for usual games, but ICO seemed to stand out from the crowd. Ueda and a handful of other artists put together a pilot movie as proof of a concept using the program Lightwave 3D on a Commodore Enigma computer. The full pilot movie footage sadly no longer exists, but pieces of it can be found combined with clips from the PS1 prototype of the game. This video was released on a Japanese-only bonus DVD that acts as a pre-order bonus for copies of The Shadow of the Colossus in 2005. Whilst this game in all its glory and storytelling came to PS2, one could only imagine how brilliant it would have been even on PlayStation 1. The story of ICO is one of tragedy. It explores the themes of isolation, freedom and fate, and sacrifice. The castle is a vast and a lonely place where ICO and Ueda are the only living beings. They long for freedom from their imprisonment, but they also face the possibility of a tragic fate. The game's art style is minimalist and atmospheric, and of course it all plays into this tragic tale that is ICO. ICO, a horned boy, is taken by a group of warriors to an abandoned castle and locked inside a stone coffin to be sacrificed. Already the story is massively tragic, as this young boy has been rejected and casted aside from his village because of horns on his head. Already we can feel the sense of isolation and deprivation within the castle, and the sound of the ambience and the eerie sounds that really gives off that feeling of loneliness. ICO would manage to escape the coffin, and as he searches the castle he comes across Ueda, a captive girl who speaks a different language. The brilliance of this game is that the dialogue is not a massive thing, but of course the communication through simple human understanding is more than enough, conveyed through emotions and feelings other than words. The shadowy creatures are the main enemies in ICO that try to capture Ueda and bring her back to the Queen. They are dark and ghostly beings and can appear and disappear into shadow portals. They have different shapes and abilities such as flying, crawling or attacking with weapons. They are all horned like ICO and other sacrificed boys, according to some sources. And of course the shadow creatures may be related to the dormant entities that are from The Shadow of Colossus, which is a prequel to ICO. The game includes many elements of the platform games. For example, the player must have ICO jump, climb, push and pull objects and perform other tasks such as solving puzzles in order to progress within the castle. These actions are complicated by the fact that only ICO can carry out such of these actions, and Ueda can only jump short distances and cannot climb over tall barriers. The player must use ICO so that he helps Ueda to cross such obstacles by lifting her to a higher ledge or arranging the environment for allowing Ueda to cross a larger gap for herself. Of course, in some cases you have to do the groundwork so Ueda can cross safely. There's really never a dull moment in the castle. It's challenging but yet fun. The pacing of the game is so enjoyable because you really feel like you're getting somewhere with each challenge and each objective, in each challenge that keeps getting increasingly more difficult. But you know you're making progress as you enter the doors that only Ueda herself can open, which adds to the beauty of the aspect of the companionship between the two. ICO needs Ueda, and Ueda needs ICO, all in a beautiful attempt to try and seek something called freedom by chasing the light and getting out of the darkness. Throughout the majority of the game, ICO and Ueda will find themselves in this castle, both on the east side and the west side, searching the entire castle for their answer to their freedom. As ICO and Ueda make their way through the castle, they end up into the courtyard section where the big gate is. That is their way out, but of course, needing to solve all the puzzles in order to make their escape, would be confronted by the queen of the castle who claims to be Ueda's mother, preventing your escape. Within this captivating, mysterious journey that Aiko and Yorda would be on, would be to open both sides of the towers by completing both of the main puzzles on both the east side of the castle to the west side, activating the gate once more, for both two of these lost souls from different worlds to make their escape, their freedom out of the clutches of the darkness and the evil queen herself. But unfortunately, like the tragic tale would be and unfold, their plans wouldn't go as smooth as they expected. The warm world staring back at them, there was a path leading down to their salvation, but in fact would just be a mirage for the disappointment of the tragedy that is the story of Aiko. Now being at the bottom of the castle, Aiko has to find his way back up. The storytelling and the gameplay really do go hand in hand. The controls of the game are super easy and fluent to use. It's easy to switch between grabbing and holding and jumping as such. There's many fun adventure platformer games like Tomb Raider, Uncharted, Assassin's Creed, all kinds of games that require you to climb through your obstacles to make your way. But there's really none that do it quite like Aiko. It's the simplicity of it that makes it so beautiful, and the environment all the more. And to add to the storytelling of Aiko's determination to get from the bottom of the castle straight back to the top to rescue Yorda is something really charming that ties in, that makes it all the more interesting to play. And the fact that the dialogue is so limited that we just have to use our environment around us that speaks to us is really magical. From the dynamic weather sounds such as hearing the rain hitting the steel and the slight lightning that crashes and the waves that are hitting the rocks, everything that really does tie in to making this game and an aesthetic that you can really feel. In a sense, there's no need for talking because the game speaks for itself. At some point through traveling through the under caverns of the castle, Aiko finds himself a magical sword of sorts that dispels the shadow creatures and opens new pathways just like Yorda did in those certain sections you can't get through. Of course, at this point Yorda has been turned to stone by the queen. And out of sheer desperation and bravery, Aiko wishes to save Yorda from the clutches of the shadow creatures who lay to waste around Yorda's stone body. Of course, at this time when you're given this new magical sword, you can find that it takes them out in one hit, compared to the 2x4 or the standard sword. This game really has a massive way of demonstrating emotion and capturing it through its music and just the story itself. The fact we're at the place where it all began, where we ourselves were trapped inside these pods, such as these horned creatures who were once sacrificed people, fighting in this emotional battle and struggle to maintain the freedom and the very connection that we've made with Yorda. It's a nice sweet little dessert to add at the end of the game for the big entire main course, because throughout most of the game you're not really fighting as such, you're more or less exploring and using the art of adventure to get around the castle. But by this section of the game, it's almost like a final boss battle, and in doing so you get to use the cool magical sword that completely eradicates these enemies within one hit. After Aiko had fought off the shadow creatures valiantly, he confronts the queen in her throne room, who reveals that she plans to restart her life anew by taking possession of Yorda's body. At the ending of the story, Aiko has one epic last battle with the likes of the Queen, having to use the cornerstones in order to protect yourself from the shadow realms in which he can take you to, turning you to stone. But by hiding behind this cornerstone, you can use to grab the sword, the very sword that you will use to defeat the Queen. But the gameplay is amazing, considering that this is practically, if not the only boss battle we have in the game. So it's really refreshing to at least have something like this at the very end of Aiko. Yes, sure, there might be no sword splashings and cool elemental powers being used as such, but we can't forget that Aiko is technically still a young boy, so this makes the battle quite impressive.
それじゃだけこちらかしら。
With the queen defeated, the castle came collapsing. Of course, the castle being somewhat of a vessel to the queen, the evil, looming presence of the castle itself had finally now been destroyed. A chapter to this dark legacy of trapped souls were now freed in a sense. But along with Ueda, her herself didn't seem to be the same, as she seemed to be within spirit shadow form instead of her body vessel. Of course, ICO was unconscious at this time, for where Ueda would rescue his lifeless body in ensuring him a nice swift escape. But of course, Ueda didn't make the escape with ICO. ICO's ending is a tragic way to say goodbye. To say goodbye and leave behind all the things that we had faced within that castle, including saying goodbye to the thing that meant the most to us, Ueda, another soul trapped within confinements within this castle. And in our desperate attempt to make this escape, it left us feeling emotional and quite empty, into a world where we felt isolated all the more. Of a bittersweet tale and an adventure that would come to an end, for our own personal happy ending that doesn't seem possible, to at least know our efforts wasn't in vain shutting down this dark fortress. Of course, the game wouldn't come to a close just yet. ICO would wake up washed up on a beach from his broken boat. The ending to ICO is quite controversial, with several interpretations to the cult classic that everybody has their own beliefs in. With one interpretation saying that some people have a darker understanding of the ending. They think that the queen did manage to possess Ueda's body, and that person ICO sees on the beach is not really Ueda but the queen in disguise. She smiles because she's escaped the castle and tricked ICO. She might have evil intentions for him or the world. Also, there's the other ending that we get to see at face value, which is ICO wakes up on the beach, far away from the castle. He thinks he's alone, but he sees a shape on the shore, and it is Ueda, who has regained her human appearance. She opens her eyes, looks at him, and smiles, and the game is a happy ending as they're both reunited. There's also an interesting second ending, but you have to beat the game again, in where you can share a watermelon with Ueda on the beach. It's really up to the audience and the player to decide what interpretation of the story they wish to take away from this. But it's interesting to know the director Ueda's take on this, because by looking at the director himself, we can probably see some truth in what the ending really may be. But I don't think we can, as the ending is left open to be poetic. For a game that is 22 years old, it really has opened the doors for many great more video games to come through. And it's all thanks to Fumito, Ueda and Team ICO back at base in Japan Studios for making this game possible that would open the door for great inspirational games that we all know in the modern era.
意味があるとすればイコの夢ですよね。終わって、本当はあそこで終わりなんだけど船の中で寝てるイコが見てる夢。ただでも本当の意味は本当に出会ってるんですからね、あそこで。
Together, James, it'll be okay.
So Iko doesn't die, but he dreams he sees Ueda when he wakes up. Nice.
そういうふうに受け取ってもらってもいいってことですね。
Well guys, this has been The Voice Box. I hope you've enjoyed this video. You know what to do. Like and subscribe, support the channel. I'm really grateful for having you on board, guys. And thank you for watching. It's fair to say that this game has definitely opened up a new pathway that really inspired a lot of games that follow in the shadow of ICO. Thank you for watching.